Hi, I'm David Abram. Welcome to the Animate Earth Dialogs, a series of conversations between me and various curious human creatures, each of them powerfully engaged in transforming and deepening our human relation to the more than human Earth. My first such dialogue, or Animate Earth conversation, is with my dear friend Richard Powers, a wonderful author, one of the most important novelists currently working in the English language. Richard and I first met in the early 2000s when I was asked to come speak at some event at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And there was this very tall, lanky man in the audience, turned out to be this wonderful writer who is also a wonderful human being. Richard has written some 12 novels as of 2019. Three Farmers on Their Way to a Dance, Plowing the Dark, Gain, Galatea 2.2, The Echo Maker, for which he won the National Book Award in 2006. Most recently, his book, The Overstory, which just a few days ago received the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. It is an outrageous novel, hugely audacious, for within it, the primary characters or motive powers or the deep agents moving the story are not humans or even animals, but are trees themselves. These immense, rooted, towering beings whom we take so much for granted, but who really inform and influence our lives every step of the way. So we met at my home just outside Santa Fe, New Mexico in the late winter of 2019. Here's our conversation. Just hoping we can reflect together a bit, ponder in conversation this edge of what is it to decenter the human? What is it to move beyond our long ingrained sense of human exceptionalism? And there are so many different angles and ways that we could approach this. I think you're somebody who has really felt into and thought about this long and hard and very deeply, and you felt into it. Clearly, lots of research went into this book, The Overstory, but a lot of my hunch is that a lot of time also spent just walking in the woods and listening and feeling.
You know, it's interesting. This is my 12th novel, and my first one was published in 1985. I began work on it around 1981. So I've been writing novels for over a third of a century, but I have to admit that I'm really a latecomer to understanding that to tell the human story, you do have to bring the non-human front and center. And it really wasn't until I was 55 or 56 before I began to turn my eyes toward these other forms of sentience and to take them seriously. The previous books, of course, had all tried to expand the domain of what stories about the human can look like, and how to take the story of the human beyond the the personal and into various domains of knowledge, ways of thinking that connect us to other frames of time, other frames of concern. But to very specifically, the very specific realization that we had become blind to huge, immense, long-lived, extremely ingenious creatures that were making possible our own existence. That came to me very late. And that was the primary impetus for writing this story. Initially, I thought the answer to that blindness for readers of fiction would be to try to tell a story focalized exclusively through the trees, to make that the narrative of, yes. Wow. It presented certain extreme technological challenges, right, technical challenges, to think of, how would you tell the story of something that lived for millennia and never moved, and make that a compelling drama, because it is a compelling drama. And I saw some people who had pushed toward that in nonfiction. For instance, there's a book by David Suzuki, the autobiography.
Yes, I know that word.
Yeah, of a tree, and he takes a single Douglas fir and tries to trace it over half a millennium. And I realized a couple things. I mean, one, that what you could possibly do in nonfiction would be an enormous challenge in fiction, because of fiction's dependence upon conflict as a mode of meaning, and also interdependence, multiple reciprocally connected agents as a form of meaning. I also realized after that initial infatuation with the idea of writing a novel from the tree's point of view, solidified into reality, that really wasn't what I was interested in doing. I did not want to say there is a narrative in the forest, no more than I had ever wanted to say there is a narrative inside the exclusive domain of people.
Right.
What I wanted to do was, in one volume, say there is a narrative that binds these two seemingly different modes of existence into a social, communal, networked, reciprocal, and interdependent, changing, dynamic whole.
Beautiful. Yeah. And you succeed very powerfully. One of the things that the Overstory induces in the reader is just this creeping sense that goodness, that meaning. Meaning is not just something that sprouts and unfurls itself out of the human brain. That meaning, this enigmatic and very magical word or term by which we signify something quite mysterious, that meaning is everywhere.
Yeah, out there.
That meaning is out there.
Yeah.
And that the multiple meanings afoot already in the terrain have informed our human sense of meaning from the get-go.
Yeah, and I do believe that our stories were once quite conversant in that view, but something has happened in the West in recent centuries and in this form called the novel that has shrunken its field of concern somehow. I mean, typically a novel would take a small number of individual humans and bump them up against each other and bump them up against themselves and put them through all kinds of convolutions and setbacks challenge their values until they could not hold their values anymore, break them down, build them back up again, and see where they were landed at the end of the day.
Yes.
It's a powerful way of exploring psychological and social meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
But
it is.
now it seems as if not a lot of novels are interested in going beyond that and bumping those humans, those individuals, and those groups of individuals up against the world beyond the human.
Yes.
And to challenge this notion that that we are sufficient unto ourselves as a field of examination.
Yes. Yes, and you and I were speaking some last night. And you were articulating some of the ways in which, just in the last few centuries, our sense of meaning has become so centered in the human. And I was suggesting that yes, and yet in many ways the novel is just taking up and furthering a propensity that's been endemic to Western civilization from the get-go, that already with the advent of formal writing systems, and in particular the phonetic writing system, the alphabet, that there is a privileging of the human voice over and against all of the other modes of speaking that surround us in the world. Clearly, many other beings are vocative and speaking, bird song and cricket rhythms, and the roars and cries of various animals, but also to our oral indigenous forebears, the speech of the wind in the willows was often a kind of voice. Thunder, sometimes spoken of as the first word by some peoples, that we lived within a world that spoke in 1,000 often green tongues. And yet with the emergence of formal writing systems, and in the West, the emergence of an alphabet, where I look at a page and I see a written character, I see a B and it makes me go buh. I see a C, I go ka. A T, ta. That is, the written letters begin to function as mirrors, reflecting the human face back upon itself. With the alphabet, it seems that language and human language begins to turn in on itself. But for the vast bulk of our human tenure here within the biosphere, we lived with a very different assumption that our discourse was simply our part of a much wider conversation carried on between the various animals, the plants, the storm clouds, and the wind. And so human speech, it seems to me, even everyday speaking, one had to be very careful not to offend these other agencies out and about, because if meaning was proliferating and being generated by other beings, if other beings were speaking, then clearly many other beings were also listening.
That's right.
To us.
You know, I'm persuaded by this idea that part of our estrangement begins with the creation of a symbolic virtual that we begin to interact with in a very powerful and privileged way. I would broaden it slightly. I would say that the temptation to think of ourselves as autonomous or as capable of exercising a degree of mastery or control or separation or independence from the rest of the living world is put forward at every turn with the invention of a new technology. And You know, I used to play this thought experiment with my students back when I taught. You know, imagine a technology that made it possible for us to annihilate distance between people, to get ascendancy over time, to be able to create time travel backwards and forwards, to give us direct communication from the dead. You know, and you see where this is going, and you know, they're thinking science fiction, and I just say it was writing that put us on a distinctive footing. And you can go back to Socrates and see what he thinks about all of the liabilities associated with introducing this incredibly disruptive technology into the realm of human affairs.
Yes,
you
in
know,
the Phaedrus. Yes.
Yeah, and he says it's going to take away our memory, and we're going to stop respecting the you know, the ordinary constraints of time and limit. And we're going to it's going to go to our heads, and you know. To some extent, he was right, but it doesn't stop with writing.
No,
it spirals outwards and outwards, and each technology, the affordances of each technology compound and accumulate. And it is precisely this sense that somehow these tools are giving us incredible leverage over the ordinary discomfort of being alive that's so seductive.
Yes.
But that's also why so many of our myths, our foundations, our core narratives, have to do with cautionary tales about thinking that these gifts don't come with their own catches.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, everything that fits into the Faust story, everything, you know, all of these prototypes of, you know, magic lamps that go haywire, and suddenly, you know, the genie is tricking you and you thought you were using the genie. You know, they are all early recognitions of these pacts that we make with these things that incredibly extend our leverage and our throw weight, and
Yes.
and
that also extend our ability to hide from the difficult ambiguity of existence, the kind of terror of finding ourselves alive in a world that is so much bigger than us, where there are things out and about that can eat us, and ultimately will eat us.
Very few of our technologies aren't being driven by an anxiety about mortality. And in fact, we joke about writing. You know, I will live forever when I write this perfect thing.
Yes.
You know, so they all do have, you know, part of the itch that various technologies scratch have to do with this ultimate limit to private individual meaning, which is death. If we were better, if we had never lost that sense of being connected in countless ways to external meaning, death wouldn't be so terrifying.
It wouldn't.
Yeah.
I agree. My sense is it's not only fear of mortality and of death, but a sort of in the moment fright of, or fearfulness of being vulnerable.
The limits to our power.
Just that I'm vulnerable to your gaze, that I am a body that is subject to the insults of disease, of being seen by others as too fat or too skinny or too pimply. We can certainly see with our most recent technologies a readiness among so many people to engage in a form of communication where I don't have to expose myself in the flesh to the face-to-face interaction, a full-bodied interaction with another person. But I can sort of dock all of that difficult vulnerability by engaging online through various forms of social media and such. And so, of course, many of our young people are alas, growing up without ever having to have forged the skills of navigating that ambiguous and fraught terrain.
So all of that was interesting to me when I set the baseline for the story, and I begin it as a kind of traditional novel with a small subset of characters. Well, maybe slightly larger than the average literary cast. So less than a dozen principal protagonists, and set them down in a world where they have already assimilated this idea that the life that's promised to them can protect them from these various things, and that if they live right and use the commodities available to them, that they can make their way and make their own meaning and be less vulnerable and be these autonomous agents. And then things come along one by one to call them out and to put them all on their own kind of road to Damascus experience, where there's a conversion or a crisis or a catastrophe, and they realize that their destiny is not theirs, and that there are these huge connections that are calling them back into their interdependence with these other living things.
Yes. So I wonder, that sparks up two different possible directions. Let's take a brief launch into one of them before getting to the other. But the brief launch is something that's very, very present in your novel. But I just wonder your thoughts on wonder itself. The place of wonder in not just, of course, the novel or the predicament that the Western novel finds itself in now, but the place of wonder at this very strange moment in which we find ourselves, this weirdly teetering moment in the story of this whirling dervish of a planet, when so many other shapes of life are biting the dust or are being pushed to the very brink of extinction by, not by our human meanness, but just by our sort of obliviousness to the reality that these other beings are actually here with us. Our inability, it would seem, to notice that there are other presences out and about that are just as outrageous and weird and creative as we are.
You know, it's interesting that word and its companion word, awe, really have been at the heart of my project from the beginning. And they begin to take center stage in my third novel, Goldbug Variations, and formulations about the necessity for wonder as a fundamental human experience first get articulated. I first articulate them in my journey in that book. When you do come face to face with something that's not you, and that bewildering in the etymological sense of that word, the disorienting, destabilizing crisis of a real confrontation with something that does not yet fit inside, the purview of your own self-definition. There are a lot of postures you can take. You can be fearful, as you say. You can be sadistic or controlling. You could be denying. You could be mechanistically explanatory. You could, and be attempting, by various means of rationality and empiricism, trying to bring it into the sweep of your own understanding. In other words, all kinds of postures, either to protect yourself from that thing, or to bring that thing into dominion. To have dominion over that thing. What is wonder? What is the posture of wonder in the confrontation that I've just put forward? I would say wonder and awe, the common denominator is, I cannot fathom you.
Right.
I cannot put you into my narrative. And consequently, I don't know who you are or what you're capable of. And even as a result of that, I don't know who I am anymore because my self-definition isn't sufficient for absorbing you.
Yes.
But they hold in abeyance all those other desires to instantly rectify that and just say it's sufficient for a moment simply to be astonished and grateful that my definition is now collapsing in catastrophe, by the sheer astonishment.
That's it. Yeah.
Of your non-meanness.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very much my sense, and beautifully articulated.
And in the book, again, it's, these people start their lives not particularly tree conscious, with one exception, whose reasons for becoming tree conscious in her early childhood have to do with her alienation from other humans.
Yes.
But, the fact that none of these people have a great capacity for wonder or for awe or see the need to take seriously things that seem to be there largely for their consumption, or and now here they are, and it doesn't work anymore.
That's right.
And they do respond to wonder, and they with wonder, and they do respond with horror when they begin to understand what our attitude as a whole, as a culture is to these creatures who none of our definitions is sufficient to incorporate or to
It sounds like what you're suggesting is that wonder is the basic gesture at the heart of ethics, of an ethical sensibility. It's that
there may even be one necessary prerequisite before you can get into that posture of wonder, which is the posture of humility.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't give up your desire to thwart, control, master, or understand, do any other operation upon that object before you say, who am I to do those things?
Yes. Although it seems to me with some of the characters in this novel,
It gets
they
thrust
stumble.
on them.
They stumble into humility
Yeah.
as a result of the breaking apart of their prior definitions.
That's right.
And categorical systems when it's just all by a kind of surprise or astonishment or difficult.
Nothing else works.
Nothing else works.
They get stripped down of ego.
I have a little nonprofit organization I founded called the Alliance for Wild Ethics, and I remember I sent you some of my initial formulations of it. The acronym of the Alliance for Wild Ethics is AWE, or AWE. Right. But ethics, it seems to me, is always deep ethics grows out of just that moment, that posture that one can never learn because it happens unexpectedly. But it can become a way of life.
And one of the questions that the book asks, one of the central sources of dramatic conflict in the book is, what happens when you glimpse that kind of ethic and the understanding that it can become a way of life, but there's no room in your culture or society for realizing that or incorporating or adopting that as a sustained practice. And now you open up this whole question of activism, when and what and how much, how far will you go?
Yes.
What, how much can this break you down? And when you don't have an outlet for doing what you know to be healthy and right, where do you turn, and what do you allow?
Yeah.
That's the extension of ethics into practice and into politics.
Yes, and it can't be by chance that the writer who many feel is sort of the Urspring or fount of an ecological sensitivity and sensibility in American awareness, Henry David Thoreau, is also the wellspring of the notion of civil disobedience, which then has had such echoes out into the world, read by Tolstoy, who's then read by Gandhi, and so some of the protagonists, or the human protagonists in your book, are just at loose ends. How do we stop this horrendous?
And they begin in that in the tradition of Thoreau, with tree sits and with chaining, with confrontation, nonviolent resistance, and get knocked back again and again and again, and they lose their faith in the capacity for that.
Yes.
They lose their belief that it can happen quickly enough to prevent the final annihilation of the thing that they're protecting.
Yes.
And that's when they step over the line. And I don't know Thoreau well enough to know at what points he's most challenged by the self-imposed notion of civil disobedience.
Right.
But I think there are moments of great rage and great anger.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And what your novel dramatizes, dramatizes certain moments in the deep ecology movement, in the radical ecological movement for sanity, coming out of the Earth Liberation Front, Earth First, Redwood Summer, when many of us, I was writing for Earth First at the time, but we're ready to give ourselves to whatever it takes to
by any
stop
means
this.
necessary, to quote another famous person who decides that there are limits to nonviolent resistance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And yet, the characters in your novel discover that there are real limits to violent resistance.
Well, there sure are, and great penalties to pay.
Mm-hmm. And it's an edge that many of us have been negotiating. It's, in some ways, it's sort of lunatic to take up a kind of, or to even preach the violent dismantling of civilization, because the other side has all the weapons.
Yeah.
And I can see no better way to sort of bring on a kind of fascist state coming down on all our heads.
Yeah.
But I have had many colleagues who tend more in that direction, just because their rage is such that they see no other possibility. It's difficult. Some who have read the novel, the Overstory, it's such a delicious piece of work, and yet Richard Powers seems to be suggesting that these actions were all for naught, that they didn't bring about very much at all.
It's not the way that I read the book, but I could see where that reading, if you are looking for a kind of consequentialism, a kind of material payoff at the end, something achieved in the measurable marketplace of natural capital.
Right. That's not the way I read the book.
There are certain reasons why it's effective to create narrative with open ending or moral ambiguity or provocation. And this book is ample in all three of those things.
Yes.
But I do believe that we will not learn how to live permanently on the earth by making quantitative concessions within the exceptionalist, market-driven, state of mind, individualist state of mind that we've
Yes.
assimilated,
Mm-hmm.
and just barter off, okay, we'll stop at 98% of, old
Right.
growth forest destruction, or we'll stop at 40% species extinction.
And we'll start, just calculating natural system services.
That's right.
And
Yeah,
yeah.
which is a losing battle in
Yeah.
itself, because you've already credited the accounting system of the other side.
Indeed.
So the long-term prospects of our survival here will depend not on those piecemeal hostage swaps, while maintaining the basic attitude of alienation and autonomy that we've created in ourselves, but by a true revolution of consciousness
Yes.
that remembers what interdependence is, and remembers what a small part of large and limited systems we are.
Yes.
and need to be. So to me, the revolution starts with seeing these other creatures, crediting them with moral agency,
Yes.
with getting what I call tree consciousness, which simply is asking yourself why it is that we give ourselves a sanctity that we deny everything else.
Yes.
Once you're there, once you're starting to ask that question, you're on the side of the revolution.
Yes.
And some trigger point will occur when a sufficient number of people are thinking that way. And it goes back to your original observations about discarding this sense that I am responsible for my own private meaning, which I make up through my own ability to consume or to possess or to own.
Yes.
Once meaning is out there again for sufficient numbers of people, it won't be a sacrifice to belong to the world. It will be a joy.
It will indeed.
Yeah.
It will indeed. There's one point in the novel when I think it's one of the passages when Patricia Westerveld, is that right? Westerford.
Yeah.
Patricia Westerford is figuring centrally. She's this remarkable botanist who, among all the characters, she just lives by wonder in relation to, well, I suppose Olivia does as well.
Mm-hmm.
But when she starts speaking of, my gosh, it's not just that a tree is not an individual. These trees are so deeply bound up with one another, exchanging nutrients, exchanging communication.
Across species.
Not just within one species, but across species, through the air, through pheromones, but also through the soil, through the mycorrhizal fungal network or web, that she begins to say that every being within the forest is the forest.
Yeah.
That the forest itself, it's not just that the trees are sentient, but that the forest is what is carrying this sentience. And every plant in the understory, as well as these huge trees, but also the fungi, also the creatures, the other animals, the birds, microbial organisms, all are part of a kind of collective sensibility that makes up the forest.
A society.
A society.
A society that includes us.
Yes.
And that's, one of the, to come back to this realization that I didn't just want to tell a story about trees any more than I ever wanted to tell a story of, just people.
Yes.
But a inseparable community that where we are all part of that society, and
Yes.
and to try to find a literary form where the human protagonists and the non-human protagonists were truly being each other's causes and effects.
Yes. Beautiful. Well, but just to push that a tiny bit further, I'm wondering if every being within the forest,
Everything in the forest is the forest. Yeah.
everything in the forest is the forest. Can we, or do you sense that at a certain moment that's also true of the Earth? That is, everything within the biosphere is the biosphere. That this spherical planet, which never discloses itself to us as a whole. Right. We only see one little corner of it, and each place, each region or bioregion is so utterly itself and utterly unique and weirdly different from every other bioregion, like this Southwest desert here, so different from the Smoky Mountains where you make your home now. Yeah. And both so different from the Hudson River estuary where Manhattan is located. And yet all of them in some manner, well, I guess what I'm wondering and puzzle sometimes in my own work is where I'm trying to make the argument that another organism, another species is richly awake in its own style of creativity, as richly and potently present and creating the present moment as I am. And yet then I'm making this argument vis-a-vis a spider and vis-a-vis a humpback whale and vis-a-vis an aspen grove. And at a certain point, I wonder, well, what sense does it make to be arguing that all of these different individual entities are sentient, experiencing presences, when in fact they're all part and parcel of a sentience that is perhaps can only be understood on a spherical level.
Yeah. So if everything in the forest is the forest, then every sentient being will change what it partakes of in sentience and intelligence depending on its communal relations to everything else that there is. And go back to a famous John Muir quote, right? But yeah, it's essential to remember that the wilderness has been shaping us for as long as we have existed. Whatever sentience we have, whatever intelligence we possess, is the result of an adaptation to all living creatures around us. By the same token, we have been shaping the forest from the beginning as strongly in our own way as any other large creature, and even some small creatures. You know, we're in that system, and it's inseparable. So you're right. You can't talk about individual intelligence. You can't talk about a privileged species intelligence without acknowledging that all of those things are what they are by virtue of the things that have adaptively shaped them and that they take as both their subjects and objects.
Yes. And one thing I've noticed often comes up when people, ever since Jim Lovelock and Lynn Margulis put forward this sense of what they were calling the Gaia hypothesis, the Earth as functioning more like an organism than like a complex set of mechanical processes. Right. Immediately the question was arising from different quarters, well, okay, if the Earth is alive, is it alive like an animal, or is it alive like a plant, like a vegetable? Yeah. And at a certain point, I realized that that's really quite a goof of a question. It's rather, if we begin to recognize that that life seems to only happen on a planetary scale. That is, it seems to happen to planets. If we recognize Earth as, or begin to just allow into our language that there is something good and useful about affirming that this world itself is alive, then that forces us, or needs to push us back to reconceptualize what it is to be an animal, what it is to be a plant.
Yeah.
Because animals and plants both then are borrowing from the spherical archetype. Just that curious thought.
Yeah. Well, something in your observation about people trying to wrap their head around this brand new way of thinking of the interdependence of biological and physical processes, and really promoting the biological to take its place on a planetary scale, and the immediate desire to know what metaphor is apt, misses the whole, dual, vice virtue of metaphors to begin with. I mean, they assist us, and then we have to discharge them as they get in our way by being not quite sufficient to the task of being the place that we're trying to understand.
Beautiful. Yeah. So before we close, just one further thought that's tickling on the edge of my awareness, which is that there's a lot of folks today wielding this fairly recently minted term, the Anthropocene. And I, for one, find myself pretty disgusted with the ease with which everybody is adopting this word. And I've been delighted to not hear it in your vocabulary. But you may be quite comfortable with the term. It's certainly become very, very central to the lingo of many of the natural sciences right now. And I have no quarrel with what the Anthropocene purports to name, the simple and very evident fact that the human has become a geological force. It's certainly, we've been a geological force at least since I was born. But that we would then say that the era of our human, the era during which human agency has become a major geological force, that we should call this by the name Anthropos. Yeah. The Anthropocene seems, and I wanted to ask you this just because as a writer you are deeply given to the language. You work in service to this great mysterious medium we call language, and I too am deeply given to language and its mysteries. And it seems to me, though, that we have to choose our terms with care. A geological epoch, calling it the Anthropocene, epochs last commonly, millions of years, but certainly hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands at the very least. It seems to call this new epoch the Anthropocene forecloses any possibility of a step toward humility, of a stepping back, of a recognition that actually we may only get through this, the horror of this time, by realizing that we are just one critter in the undergrowth, that we are just one of the gang.
Let me weigh in.
Yeah, please.
So all names are metaphors.
Right.
And as such, they partake of that dual nature of metaphors that we were talking about earlier. A metaphor can bring us to see a relationship that we were blind to, but it can also blind us to differences that we ignore once we assimilate that metaphor. And I think I see what you're saying. There is some utility, a wake-up call, if you will, to say that we've reached the scale of activity and manipulation of matter and atmosphere and hydrosphere and soil to the point where we have become epochal and geological of forces. And yet that same term runs the risk of being abused and creating further sense of human exceptionalism and a kind of self-applauding or self-celebration.
It seems to certify human ascendance.
So as with my observation earlier, I think we have to find the positive affordance and avoid the negative one, and use it where it's helpful and jettison where it's not. Let me take that same issue into a smaller and a quieter place just to close out, one that's maybe a little less profound, but it could be a gentle way to get back in the woods. The effect of the name and its dual nature has outward consequences, but also inward ones. What does it do to our thought process to use the name for the thing? I was blind to trees until I was 55, as I said earlier. Then I undertook this amazing and joyful process of starting to try to see them. And that will continue for the rest of my life. It initially starts with a kind of anxiety. What is this one? Yeah. And how is it different from this one? Yeah. And if you don't have any names at all, they're all big green things up on trunks with you don't have a lexical or a cognitive category to begin to make distinctions. And it becomes handy to say, there are conifers, and there are angiosperms, deciduous angiosperms, or there are deciduous conifers. So that's where the labels become tricky. They start to clarify your thought, and then they start to possibly reify themselves and blind you to other ways of seeing the particularity of what's in front of you. So it's helpful to say, to have a term, oh, I know what beeches do. Oh, I know what alders do. And
for sure,
when you do this exercise of presence, of tree consciousness, and you stand in front of that tree, if you don't have the name, you can't see its distinctiveness. If you do have the name, you have to be careful of not blinding yourself to the distinctiveness of what that particular beech, that particular alder is doing in front of you.
Indeed.
So we are always in this tension between lumping and splitting, between seeing similarities and seeing differences. And that's not a resolvable process. And we have to be careful with words, as with trees, to know that that same thing in a different place, at a different time, in a different context, with a different me, is going to set up a different relationship that has both capacity for further sight and capacity to occlude my sight. Yeah. So the secret is, how to get as close to the nameless thing as you can by using names along the way to guide you. That may be another word for wonder.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, thanks, man. This has been a delightful conversation.
Pleasure talking.
I'll just own up that it seems to me there are, and I fully agree with your sense of names as both revealing and hiding the Anthropocene seems a goof to me because it hides too much. But I see such delight in it from so many people within the humanities.
Yeah, it's too abusable. It's too self-congratulatory.
But I was, because it seems to foreclose humility. I've wondered, because many people are now using it to say, look, we broke it, we own it. It's up to us to manage this.
And
this
once again,
spaceship,
we're the only input.
Right.
We're the only game of consequence.
Why not work with the fact that one name for our species, the human, is cognate with the word humility,
right.
because both come from the humus, the soil. And so why not? I'm just trying to tickle various friends and colleagues into the possibility of calling this era the Humilocene.
Nice.
That is to say, it's that if we really need to underscore that our species has had a major hand in what is unfolding, maybe we should call it the Humilocene, which sounds a bit goofy at first because it sounds a bit like humiliation for one thing.
Well,
but I think we ought to be humiliated by what we have wrought.
Certainly
as
humbled.
a species.
Yeah.
And when it's a matter of giving a name to something that will last thousands of years, I think memory is really important, and having a mnemonic way of remembering what we did and look what we brought about by our callousness and our obliviousness. So that's one reason why I'm floating that other name out and about. But brother, your work has been so key in this era of the world in opening our eyes and our ears and our language to the wonder of the real in its polymorphous, perverse multiplicity.
Whatever I've been able to throw back into the community has come from a million places, yours included.
Beautiful. Thank you.